Okay, absolute value equations. Probably before we talk about absolute value equations, we probably just need to talk about this idea of just absolute value. Absolute value, from the first time you've ever heard about absolute value, which was probably quite a long time ago, it means distance from zero, okay? So, I think oftentimes we try to think about absolute value as the opposite. It's not the opposite, okay? It's distance from zero. So, for example, if I'm talking about the absolute value of -5, what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about, okay, I've got 0, okay, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got -5. The absolute value of -5 is how many steps it would take you to get from -5 to 0, which is 5, right? Okay, so the absolute value of -5 is 5. But what happens here is if I talk about the absolute value of +5, well, this is like saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm over here at 5, and I want to know, well, how many steps is it going to take to get me to 0? And here's the thing, we're talking about steps, not direction, right? We're just talking about steps. Well, it also take you 5 steps, right? So the absolute value of -5 is 5, and the absolute value of 5 is 5, okay? Big thing about absolute value, it's always positive, which I think is where it can get a little confusing with what we're doing today. Because today we're kind of approaching this in the opposite direction, okay? Over here we're saying, okay, the absolute value of -5. How far is -5 from 0? Well, it's 5 steps. What we're going to do is we're going to ask the question in the opposite way. And we're going to want to know, well, what can I take the absolute value of and get 5? And we just saw that above, didn't we? Right? The absolute value of -5 is 5. And the absolute value of +5 is 5. There's 2 answers here, okay? X could be 5, or X could be -5. Another way to think about this, okay, how I think about this, is you're saying, okay, something is 5 steps away from 0. So think about it in the opposite way. Instead of starting at -5 and 5 and getting to 0, start at 0 and ask yourself, well, if I were to take 5 steps, where could I be? Well, I could go 5 steps to the right and get to 5, or I could go 5 steps to the left and I could get to -5. Okay? So we're going to have some super simple problems kind of like that, and then we're going to have ones that are a little bit more difficult that might be something like this. Well, x plus 2 equals 5. The absolute value of x plus 2 equals 5. Here's the thing. If you have something like this, I want you to cover up what's on the inside of the absolute value and just approach it like this. First of all, something has an absolute value of 5. Okay, well, if you start at 0 and you take 5 steps, because that's what we're asking here, where could you end up at? Start at 0 and take 5 steps. Where could you get? -5 and 5. So this could equal 5, or this could equal -5. Right? Whatever's inside here could be a 5, or it could be a -5. The difference is it's an x plus 2 inside of there. So I know that x plus 2 could equal 5, or x plus 2 could equal -5. And then you would solve both of these. And we get x equals 3. Subtract 2, we get x equals -7. Because think about this, if you check this, if I plug in 3 plus 2 is 5, the absolute value of 5, right? And if I plug in -7, -7 plus 2 is -5, but the absolute of -5, also 5, right? See how it works? Okay. Now the last thing to watch out for is something like this. So this says the absolute value of x minus 3 equals -2. Now what I want you to do is kind of cover up what's on the inside. Something has an absolute value of -2. Okay? Something is -2 steps away from 0. Here's the problem. We're talking about steps as in not direction. What number, and once again, kind of ignore what's on the inside there, what number has an absolute value of -2? 2. 2 has an absolute value of -2. 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 2 has an absolute value of - the two options would be 2 and negative 2, right? The two kind of natural options. But you're saying, what's the absolute value of 2? 2. What's the absolute value of negative 2? 2, right? Is there any number in the whole world that has an absolute value of negative 2? It's not possible. There's nothing in the entire world that could be inside there and make that true. So anytime you have a problem that says the absolute value of something equals a negative number, it's no solution. It doesn't work. Okay? Questions on that? Okay, let's get this glued into page 31. This is 3.7, and we'll call this absolute value equations. Absolute value equations. Okay, when solving absolute value equations or inequalities, this is going to be true for what we do tomorrow, okay? The number one thing you have to do, and I didn't mention it on the left-hand side, and maybe I should have, you have to isolate the absolute value first. Okay, that's the biggest thing here, okay? You have to isolate the absolute value and anything inside of the absolute value first. Then we can go ahead, what we're going to end up doing is break it apart into two equations and solve both equations. Kind of like what we did last week with the combined inequalities. So number one says the absolute value of b equals 2/3. So first thing we want to do is we want to make sure the absolute value is isolated and anything inside of it. Now in this case it's the absolute value of b equals, it's isolated, okay? Once your absolute value is isolated, regardless what is inside of your absolute value bars, you're going to ask yourself, well, what has an absolute value of 2/3? Or another way of asking that, if I start at 0 and take 2/3 of a step, where could I end up at? 2/3 or negative 2/3. Whatever is inside here could be 2/3 or it could be negative 2/3. Whatever's inside those absolute value bars has to be a 2/3 or negative 2/3. Now in this case, it's just b. So b could be 2/3 or b could be negative 2/3. Okay, number two. What if I have the absolute value of n plus 2 equals 5? Okay guys, biggest thing, okay? Absolute biggest thing you have to do. The absolute value bars have to be the only thing on that side of the equal sign. Is that true for this one? No. Okay? I need this to say the absolute value of n equals. I need that absolute value to be the only thing. So I need to get rid of the plus 2. Well, how do we get rid of a plus 2? Yeah, subtract 2. So we have the absolute value of n equals 3. Once your absolute value is isolated, now you can say, okay, something has an absolute value of 3. Another way of asking that, if I start at 0 and I were to take 3 steps, where could I end up at? Negative 3 or positive 3. So whatever is inside here could equal 3 or it could equal negative 3. Well, what's inside there is just an n. So n could be 3 or n could be negative 3. Okay. What if I have 7 times the absolute value of d, this is number 3, equals 49? 7 times the absolute value of d equals 49. Okay, remember guys, the absolute value and anything inside of it has to be the only thing on that side of the equal sign. Is that true with this one? No. I've got that 7. Now, just like you're solving a normal equation, how would you get rid of that 7? Yeah, it's 7 times. So to get rid of it, we would divide by 7. So then we'd have the absolute value of d equals 7. Once your absolute value is isolated, now you can say, okay, something has an absolute value of 7. Well, what has an absolute value of 7? Negative 7. The absolute value of negative 7 is 7, and the absolute value of positive 7 is 7. So whatever's inside there could equal 7 or could equal negative 7. Well, what's inside there is just d. So d could be 7 or d could equal negative 7. Okay, those ones are pretty simple. Do you guys have questions on those ones? Okay. What if I have something like this? The absolute value of r minus 9 equals 3. Now be careful here, because my first question to you is going to be, is the absolute value and anything inside of it isolated? Yeah. I mean, you kind of look at that minus 9, right? Because it's not just an R, it's a minus 9. But the minus 9 is inside the absolute value, okay? Now, as much as we'd like to, you cannot add or subtract things or multiply or divide things from inside and outside of the absolute value. So even if you wanted to add 9, you can't add 9 because it's not really a minus 9. It's like an absolute value of 9. I'm not really sure what it is. You cannot add or subtract or multiply or divide things in and out of the absolute value, okay? So just like we did over here, when your absolute value is isolated, you're ready to say, okay, what could be in here? What has an absolute value of 3? What numbers are 3 steps away from 0? 3 and negative 3. So whatever's inside there, right, the absolute value of 3 would be 3, and the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Here's the difference. Inside here is an R minus 9. So R minus 9 could be 3, or R minus 9 could be negative 3, which then we have to solve. So add 9, we get R equals 12. Add 9, we get R equals 6. And you can check your answer. 12 minus 9 is 3. The absolute value of 3? 2. 6 minus 9 is negative 3. The absolute value of negative 3. Okay. So we're doing the same thing we did over here, except you're going to have to take it one more step to solve. Okay? Let's try another one of those. Number 5. The absolute value of C plus 3 equals 15. Okay, first thing, the absolute value has to be isolated. Anything inside the absolute value is fine. Anything outside of the absolute value is not. Okay? Is the absolute value isolated? Because that plus 3 is inside, right? I couldn't take the plus 3 out even if I wanted to, because it's inside the absolute value. So, I'm ready to say, okay, something has an absolute value of 15. If you start at 0, you take 15 steps. Where could you get to? 15 or negative 15. So whatever's inside there could be a 15, right, because the absolute value of 15 is 15. Or it could be a negative 15, because the absolute value of negative 15 is 15. The difference is what's in here is a C plus 3. So C plus 3 could be 15, because the absolute value of 15 is 15. Or C plus 3 could be negative 15, because the absolute value of negative 15 is also 15. And then if I were to solve each of these, subtract 3, we get negative 18. Oh, just kidding. Subtract 3, we get 12. Let's try that again. Subtract 3 over here, and we get negative 18. Not very good at writing today. So 12 and negative 18 would be your answers. Now what if I have something that looks like this? What if I have negative 3 times the absolute value of 2W equals negative 6? Remember, the first thing, your absolute value has to be isolated. Is my absolute value isolated here? No. The 2's inside, but the negative 3 is not. I need to get rid of that negative 3 first. Now, keep in mind we're using inverse operations, so the first thing I kind of need to figure out is what operation this is, so I can do the opposite. What operations between the negative 3 and the absolute value? Multiplication. So to get rid of it, we're going to divide by negative 3. So I ended up with the absolute value of 2W. Negative 6 over negative 3 gives me 2. Now that the absolute value is isolated because the 2 is inside the absolute value, we can say, okay, something has an absolute value of 2. Okay? So whatever's inside there could be 2, or it could be a negative 2. So 2W equals 2, or 2W equals negative 2. We can divide by 2, we get W equals 1. Divide by 2, W equals negative 1. Is it making sense? Yes. Now, that's a very good point, okay? Are you talking about up here or down here? Yeah. Up here? Right here? Okay. The reason why I can't just automatically say, okay, no solution, is because it doesn't say the absolute value equals a negative number. It says negative 3 times the absolute value equals a negative number. Now, where you could stop and look at that is right here. See right here where it says the absolute value equals a positive 2. So the negative kind of works itself out. I love that you're thinking ahead on that one. Okay? Okay, let's try this one. Number 7. What if I have negative 2 times the absolute value of 3d equals 4? Okay, what's the first thing I would need to do here? I need to get rid of that negative 2, so I would divide by negative 2. So I'd end up with the absolute value of 3d equals negative 2. Now, what do you notice? Yeah, this time, you guys see it? It says the absolute value of something equals negative 2. What has an absolute value of negative 2? Nothing. This is where you can say, okay, yeah, no solution. It's not possible. When you have the absolute value isolated, if it says negative, then you would be able to go ahead and say no solution. Okay, number 8 says 4 times the absolute value of v minus 5 equals 16. Okay, first thing, is the absolute value isolated? No. How would I get rid of the 4? Divide by 4. So we have the absolute value of v minus 5 equals 4. Now that the absolute value is isolated, what's my next step? What's my next step here? Now I can't add 5 because it's inside the absolute value bar. So I can't add or subtract things outside of the absolute value. Okay, something has an absolute value of 4. Well, what numbers are 4 steps away from 0? So this could be 4, or it could be negative 4. V minus 5 could equal 4, and v minus 5 could equal negative 4. Now, okay, now I can add 5 because it's v minus 5. It's not the absolute value of v minus 5. Now it's just v minus 5. Now I can solve that and get v equals 9, add 5 over here, get v equals 1. Okay, let's do one more together, and then I'll have you try the last one on your own. Okay, number 9 says the absolute value of 3f plus 1 minus 1 on the outside equals 7. Okay, first thing is my absolute value isolated. Not quite. Not quite. There's kind of a lot going on here, but what's the first thing I need to do? Now, great idea. I need to get rid of the negative 1, okay? I would divide by negative 1 if it was 3f plus 1 times negative 1. Is this times negative 1? It's a minus 1, isn't it? Right? So you would add 1. Yeah. Very good. So we have the absolute value of 3f plus 1 equals 8. Now, once you isolate the absolute value, okay, you're going to follow the same steps. And I know they're kind of tricky. It's kind of a lot of steps, but it's the same steps for every problem. Once you isolate the absolute value, you're ready to say, okay, what is 8 steps away from 0? 8 and negative 8. So you're going to do this every time. You're going to say equals 8 equals negative 8. And then whatever's inside here is what goes on the other side. 3f plus 1, 3f plus 1. And then you're ready to solve. So if I subtract 1, we have 3f equals 7. Divide by 3, we have f equals 7/3. And for the other one, subtract 1, we'd have 3f equals negative 9. Divide by 3, we'd have f equals negative 3. Okay, now for the last one, I'm going to put it on the board. I want you guys to work it out on your own. I'm going to work it out kind of slowly on the board, so I'll give you a head start, and then I'll work it out slowly on the board. So if you get stuck and you want to kind of check, then go ahead and check. Whenever you're all finished, check your answer with what's on the board. If it's correct, go ahead and get started on your homework. Remember, no graphs on your homework, no matter what the directions say. And then if you have questions, let me know. So number 9 says 3 times the absolute value of d minus 4 equals 12. So I'll give you guys a head start, and then I'll start to work it out slowly on the board.